All right, she's back joining us here on the program, former Chief of Staff to Representative Adam Kinzinger, and the founder of BlueStack Strategies, our friend Maura Gillespie. Maura, Mike, and Nick, thank you so much for hopping back on the podcast with us.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah, Maura, we were talking about this off air, and as we're recording this episode, obviously the news just came in. I wanted to pivot for a second before we get into a bunch of the stuff on the GOP side, the former president, but this tragic shooting that happened in Tennessee at a school, a local school, I forget what type of school. 6 people so far as of this taping have been killed, 3 adults, 3 children. You and I were talking about something off air with respect to whenever these situations always happen, Nick and I always do the same thing. It's like a wash, rinse, and repeat type of emotional response, unfortunately. And it's really because of lawmakers, similar to, the people that you interacted with. You mentioned some of this off air. I wanted to bring it over here because it's like, we could do something about this. There's one common denominator in all these things. And it's not, CRT textbook. It's not video game violence. It's not a TikTok, right? It's all a gun that's being used in all of these. Give me some of your takeaways as you have been reading the news and everything that happened here in this shooting in Tennessee. Give me some of the thoughts and emotions that are running with you right now.
It's horrible to watch anytime there's a school shooting or any shooting, truthfully, but especially when it's an elementary school. This is happening in a Nashville elementary school, and it's frustrating. Is the least of it, right? That there's so much that can be done, and I think that not only in this country, but our government, there's so much that can be done, but especially in the Republican Party, they have an opportunity to stand up and be an adult in the room. There's so many things they could do, but they choose not to. And for what reason? Is it the campaign finance, the campaign donations? Is it one fraction of their base that is adamant that we need assault style weapons? We don't. But a big factor too, and one thing that I would say is that having school resource offices in every school, that is important, because unfortunately where we are in this country, we need that. Our kids need to be protected. And it's just really frustrating because there's so many things that the GOP, and especially in the House that they have control now, can do, and they're just choosing not to.
More, it always seems like this has always been a polarized conversation where there is a fraction of Congress that's just sort of entrenched in one view of this, and the other side has. And this isn't, yes, it's mostly a Democratic Republican thing, but in your experience in Republican politics, where seems to be, if any, a potential middle ground of the ability to move votes one way or the other, to be more sympathetic to some form of registration, restriction, more preventative laws to try to avoid tragedies like today?
So after the Dayton and El Paso shootings in the summer, I believe it was 2019, in the summer of 2019, we introduced, the congressman put out an op-ed citing 3 different areas that we could and should have broad support on. We had already talked about bump stock bans. We talked about red flag laws, and we talked about bumping the age up from 18 to 21 to buy assault, weapons. So I thought those were pretty common sense things. Again, I personally, I'm not a gun owner, but I personally don't understand the need for an AK-47 or an AR style for any civilian. I just don't see that need. I think you can go hunting with something else. I don't think you need to have these guns at your home. I just don't. That's a personal preference, a personal belief of mine. But there are a lot of things that we can do. Again, the school resource officer, former Congressman Rodney Davis, had put forth legislation. It, to my understanding, has gone nowhere, but having them in every school in the country, to me, seems like a no-brainer. But I'm disappointed in the Republican Party for what I think is a huge missed opportunity to stand up and actually turn the table on the whole entire gun debate. They could really be the adult in the room, and they're just choosing not to.
So many different directions we can go there, but I'm glad you kind of fed into the GOP part of this, because, our last couple of episodes, we've been talking about the former president going on a social media platform to say he's going to be arrested. Now he's saying he's not going to be arrested. Who knows what to make of all that? But obviously he's out there giving campaign speeches, as he's already announced that he's going to be running. We know what that part of the party looks like, right? That faction of the MAGA Republican base, as it's been labeled by everybody. And now you have this challenger in Ron DeSantis that still has not announced in terms of whether or not he would run for president. Obviously, it looks like he's going to. What do you make of the GOP 2024 race right now, as somebody steeped in GOP politics over the last decade plus? Because Nikki Haley, Tim Scott, Mike Pence, Ron DeSantis, and former President Trump, the makeup of this party, the direction, sometimes the policy aims or lack thereof. What do you get a sense of in terms of the direction of the GOP in 2024 and beyond?
It's going to be really interesting to see who else formally announces that they're throwing their hat in the ring and running for a president. I think right now, and with what Trump has said and done, is a stark contrast, whether you like Nikki Haley or not, to what Nikki Haley is saying, especially when it comes to our enemies. Trump's recent video, I think it was out 2 weeks ago, insinuated that we should be or as provoking a civil war with one another, as opposed to being in deep conflict with Russia, China, and they're building alliances, which they are doing. That is the threat to America's freedom, democracy, and we should take it as such. For President Trump to be pointing fingers and saying that we are at civil war, or wants us to be, more or less, with the Liberal Party versus the Conservative Party, I mean, that is just beyond dangerous. And his running for president, and again, he was in Waco, Texas, I believe it was yesterday, did this rally. It is fear mongering on a level of I haven't seen in my lifetime. It to me, that's a real problem. So anyone who's going up against President Trump has to be a completely stark contrast to that in the GOP field, in my opinion.
Speaking of the former president, and previously when we had you on, something we talked about was just the growing social media presence and messaging that we're seeing from candidates, not necessarily far left, far right, yes, amplified so, but in general, it seems that it's almost part of standard operating procedure to have some social media presence, to put a message out to voters. Coupling that with what we saw recently with the hearings around TikTok, and just, it often seems, I'm only going to speak from my own experience here, that the second that the cameras go on certain members of Congress, there is a level of performative gesture that seems somewhat cartoonish. With all that in mind, where is your assessment just in terms of messaging, the role of cameras in Congress? Should we be rethinking the way that candidates, or rather the way that political officials are using cameras or social media platforms to put out sound bites and messages that don't really necessarily feel complete about where constituents are in the needs of their respective districts or states?
Absolutely. And I think we touched on this when we spoke last year, which I think it was last year, but members of Congress were not supposed to be celebrities. They are not supposed to be these household names that everyone knew what they had for lunch that day and where they're headed to the next, which gym class they're taking that weekend. That wasn't supposed to be what our members of Congress were. They were supposed to go to Washington, D.C., represent their constituents, and go home and live their lives. But it has become more of a performative art of, I'm going to get famous by doing this or by saying this or going in front of this camera and saying outlandish things, and then I'll raise a ton of money off of it. I mean, Trump, going back to what former President Trump did, was he put out that message on his Truth Social, and he fundraised that day, that night, and raked in a ton of money. And we're seeing people in the right wing flank, but also you're seeing Democrats do it too, who see that kind of success, whether you like it or not, and model after it. They're doing that too because it is effective. And when I saw Utah just passed a bill banning social media for kids under 18. Obviously, the TikTok hearings that happened on the Hill last week. The social media aspect of our world has changed things, has changed how we perceive other people, all with rose-colored glasses for a large part, and what we present to the world as ourselves. We put our greatest hits out there. So when we're watching members of Congress who do this only for, in my opinion, a lot of cases, for campaign benefits and to, again, get attention, it's damaging to the constituents who are looking for safety in their schools, who are looking for clean drinking water out of their reservoirs. I mean, we're seeing issues in communities across the country that are being largely ignored at the behest of their congressman being too busy playing on his Twitter account. And that's dangerous.
Yeah. To that end, too, in terms of where our attention currently lives, recently we've obviously had a hearing around TikTok. with the House or with the Republicans taking back the House. Obviously, there was conversations about Hunter Biden and a lot of what we're also seeing in terms of, well, most recently, the education bill, the Parents' Bill of Rights that's being put forward. In your assessment of just the initiatives that Republicans have put forward since taking back the House, does that seem consistent with what Republicans seem to have run on, which was a concern about economic factors and, well, primarily economic factors, actually. But how do you make sense of the attempts to run on one thing and then really pivot to what seems to be more of a social or conspiratorial push?
It seems to me that they didn't have a plan, and that's what we're watching, is that it's happening kind of what feels like to me as things progress or as things flare up, they'll address it then. There's not an actual plan in place to address our economic issues. A lot of that is just a blame game that goes on between them and the Biden administration. And when it comes to TikTok, I will say the focus, while yes, it's on the social media and the impacts that social media has, but a lot of it too is on China. And that, I think there is a lot of, and what the TikTok hearing did show us was a lot of bipartisan support on addressing the real threat that China poses to us, to our intellectual property, to our youth. And so I think that was a positive last week, seeing that committee come together and agree that there are some serious concerns about the data that TikTok is keeping and the connection they have to the Chinese Communist Party.
Maura, I want to ask you, because you just mentioned there, we were talking about some of the committees and some of the stuff that's happening on Capitol Hill right now. But only one person on this call has actually helped a congressman set up for a committee hearing. Okay. And newsflash, it's not Nick Severi. So, Maura, can you take our audience inside what that preparation kind of looks like? Obviously, Adam was so front facing on the January 6th committee stuff. But for people like Nick and I in our audience that's watching and listening to this, like, what entails in all of that, in preparing for a committee hearing, getting things set for the congressman or woman to say there on the podium, like take us inside that process.
Yeah, so a lot goes into it, especially for the January 6th hearings, because they were televised. And the ones that weren't, we also had prep materials for the ones that were, depositions and things of that nature that were either in person or on Zoom. But for the hearings that the congressman was either point on or co-lead on, we had several run-throughs, whether that was with the other member who we were working with the lawyers on the committee staff, with the entire committee present. We did a few run-throughs in that room before, going over, okay, here's the speech, here's how we are going to structure it, because we're also telling a story. We're laying out the facts of here's what happened, and then here's what happened. So you have to do it in a way that is digestible to the American people, but also tells the truth of what's happening and corresponds with the evidence that we had. So there was a lot of rehearsal. I mean, rehearsal sounds like it's performative, but it more so going to run through so that there isn't a 4-hour hearing happening each week. But it's a lot of work. I mean, we also put out opening statements, closing statements, and working on that together.
All right, that's great insight there. This is why we have her on the program. She's a former chief of staff to Representative Adam Kinzinger. She once upon a time too worked for the Speaker of the House, John Boehner, and obviously the founder of Blue Stack Strategies. And you can catch her, by the way, if you're turning on Fox News one day or turning on MSNBC, she's everywhere. She's all over the place. Maura Gillespie, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. Truly appreciate it. You know you're welcome back anytime.
Thank you guys so much. I appreciate it.
Hey, thanks for watching the Can We Please Talk podcast. Whatever clip you just watched, we hope you enjoyed it, and we hope you stick around for some more. Subscribe to the channel. My partner's over here smashing the button. Come on, do him a favor. So hit subscribe.